Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Good evening to everybody. We had already a very exciting afternoon talking about oral history archives. And now we welcome the newcomers. And for those who don't know me, I am Ricky van Boeschoten, chair of the Greek Oral History Association. And we have the pleasure to introduce to you Rob Parks, lead curator of oral history of the British Library and of the National Life Stories collection of the British Library. And he will talk about listening to history, using oral history and memory in museums and galleries. And I think it's a very good topic to combine with our seminar, because actually in this moment museums are playing a very crucial role both in collecting and in divulgating oral history in Greece. So please, Rob, Dimitra wants to say something, yes?
I would like to thank for in the introduction the students for our seminar course in oral history in the Department of History and Archaeology that volunteered to record the lecture by Rob Parks. I thank them very much, not only because they're here, but because they're an excellent group of students that conduct amazing interviews who are still a collection in our department, but with the vision of becoming an archive of oral history. Thank you all so much.
Thank you again. I'm going to try and avoid using the microphone because I tend to walk about a bit, and often because I get enthusiastic about things like oral history. But it's fantastic to be back in Athens. I have a great fondness for Greece, and I feel that I've been with you on the journey of developing oral history in Greece, because Ricky's involved me at various points, and I've got to know some of you in the room, so I feel increasingly I'm coming home when I come to Greece. And I also have a house in the Marne, so there's another reason for coming to Greece. So tonight I'm really, as Ricky says, here to set the scene really for what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So tomorrow is going to be very practical, it's going to be discursive, and tonight I really wanted to set the scene by saying a little bit, by reflecting on the way in which I've been involved in using oral history in various gallery and public history contexts, but also to reflect a little bit on the development of the use of oral history in museums and galleries across the world over the last 20 or 30 years. So these are some of the questions I'm not necessarily answering, but I'm certainly going to be asking some of these questions. Why is it that from around the 1980s, suddenly oral history emerged in many museums and galleries around the world, not just in the UK and Europe, but elsewhere? What happened in the 1980s? Secondly, what are we currently thinking about the way in which oral history has been used in museums and galleries in different places around the world? Obviously, I'm going to be drawing particularly on UK examples, and I'll be interested to hear in questions afterwards from all of you what you make of what I'm saying in terms of the Greek experience. Thirdly, and this is the practical part of the talk, I'm going to try and share with you some good and bad examples about how oral history has been used in various public history contexts, many of them in museum galleries, but some others as well, and give you some examples of those. And I'm going to touch as I go along on some of the theoretical thinking, but also some of the sort of interpretive thinking as well. So that's a bit of an overview of what I'm going to try and do. As I say, I'm not going to necessarily answer all those questions, but I'll try as I go along. So let's start with a little bit of theory. And we'll start with a little bit of Ron Greeley. Those of you that have read some oral history literature will not have failed to have come across one of the very important figures in American oral history, based at Columbia University, called Ron Greeley. And I still use his definition of oral history as a sort of guiding light for a definition, because of course oral history is contested. There isn't one definition, but I think his is pretty good. And his uses a very important word for us as curators of material in the public context, which is reconstruction. One of the things we're all trying to do, are we not, as oral historians, is to reconstruct the past. And in that sense, people who use material culture in exhibition contexts are doing similar things with objects. So it immediately tells you that there's a clear relationship in the representation of the past between objects, material culture, and memory. And the mystery to me has been that until relatively recently, so few museum curators really understood that important relationship, that you can use memory to reconstruct the past in a visual sense. So that's an important point that I'm going to be making this evening. The other point I'm making is from the book by Lynn Abrams, which is a fantastic book, and if you want to read one book of oral history theory, Lynn Abrams' book is the book to read. It's in its second edition. It's called Oral History Theory, but don't be put off.
It has been translated into Greek.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Brilliant. What's the Greek? What's the Greek?
Proforικής Ιστορίας. But it's
the same one.
The same one. Okay. Well, it's a really good book, and this I like this quotation from right at the beginning of her book, where she makes an equally valid point to Ron Greeley, which is, and moves it on a bit. I think she's making the point that oral history is both the process of conducting and recording interviews in order to elicit information about the past, which is what we all know. But also that it has a product. There's a product from that interview, which is the narrative account of past events. Now, there's two. They sound similar, but there's two different things going on there. And if we think about taking those into the public sphere and interpreting oral history in museum contexts, you could interpret process as meaning possibly community collecting. In other words, it's a way of involving the community in creating museum exhibits. Okay? And then the products, you can think of that as the collaborative and collective interpretation of the material that you're collecting. Now, these are really crucial concepts, I think, if we're to understand how we can make use of oral history and memory in museum contexts. Number one, you're reconstructing, but number two, it's a means of involving the community in the creation of that material and making it relevant by introducing narratives which may be conflicting narratives, but they're narratives that talk to the objects within the gallery. So I'm going to try and illustrate some of these theoretical ideas as we go along. But I think this is a very good starting point to begin to challenge us a bit when we're thinking about what we're trying to do by using memory in these contexts. Now, of course, as we know, moving on, oral history is not a simple concept. When Paul Thompson started doing oral history in the late 60s, he really thought of oral history as a sort of rescue archaeology of people's memories. So there were these people out there with memories locked into their heads, and the challenge for oral historians was to get that information. And it was as simple as that, actually, when oral history started. But over the intervening 40, 50 years now, we now understand that actually it's a very, very complex process that's going on. First of all, the actual evidence itself is complex. So you have life story, which is the first-hand evidence, but you also, as we know, have oral tradition, received evidence, second-hand, third-hand evidence, passed down from generations, other material that people have within their memories, which isn't directly witnessed. And of course we have story and myth, things that are completely created, which don't necessarily have a factual basis, but are a means of conveying elements of those memories. So first of all, we know that oral history is made up of these three different types of evidence. So the challenge, of course, for us as museum curators, say, is how do we convey the complexities of memory when it's made up of these different elements? And then, of course, we come on to the things that a lot of oral historians, Ricky and I, go to international conferences and we talk a lot about subjectivity. You know, what is it, as Sandro Portelli tells us, about errors, myths and inventions that can lead us to the meaning of facts. So undermining the whole basis of facts and really arguing that oral history is a subjective experience and other people's experiences will be different. I mean, we know this as oral historians. You interview people, they tell you different things. The challenge again, how do we convey this in a museum context? And then there's a whole host of other things that are relevant for us to be thinking about when we're interpreting memory. The role of the interviewer. Do we acknowledge the role of the interviewer in the gallery when we're presenting an extract of oral history? Is the interviewer present? Do we edit out the interviewer? Does the interviewer have a role in the interpretation of that memory? Intertextuality. We've heard already this afternoon about many of you collecting diaries and photographs and so on. But what is the relationship between those? Ricky's going to talk a bit tomorrow about this when we're looking at paper archives and comparing them with oral history archives. But obviously in a classic museum context, what you're doing is you're putting objects, paper, captions, text alongside the memories themselves. How do they all talk to each other and how do you represent that in a gallery context? So the point I'm making here really is that as curators, I think it is our role to problematise memory. So many oral history exhibits that I go to, they use the oral history in a very simplistic way. We have an interview with X, he tells us X, we type it up, we put it on the gallery wall, that's an extract that tells us something about this factory. I think there's a real opportunity here to move that on a bit, to problematise it and challenge audiences a bit. Maybe give them two contrasting quotations about the same thing that will challenge listeners, engage listeners and make them think in a slightly different way. And certainly we should be challenging this really simplistic notion that sometimes comes across from new galleries, is that they are telling you a truth. We know, don't we, as oral historians, that there isn't such a thing as a truth. There's lots of truths, and it's for us as historians and curators to help interpret that truth. So why is it that we can't we do that very well in books, but why don't we do it in museum galleries? And I think, again, there should be ways of doing that. Now, just to give you an example of what I mean, and I'm going to hope that the audio is working and that you can follow what's going on here. I'm going to play you a clip that we've used. I use this a lot I've used it in gallery context, I've used it on a CD, and I think it's a very neat way of contrasting different viewpoints. So there's two things that you're going to hear here. The first is an actual recording, very rare recording, made in 1934 in Olympia, you can see here on the left, of one of the black shirt meetings, the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s, and this is an incredibly rare recording. I think it's the only recording that was made of one of these rallies. And it looks a bit like Nuremberg in 1930s, doesn't it? And that was the popularity of fascism in Britain at the time. And this is the leader that you're going to hear a recording of, Oswald Mosley. But you're also going to hear another account from a guy called Lou Kenton. He was a communist opponent of the British Union of Fascists. And he went into this hall, can you imagine? 10 of them went in here, and they decided that as he spoke, they would jump up and they would start to shout. Can you imagine how terrifying this must have been? So what you hear is the two things interwoven. And if you listen very carefully, I don't know if you're going to be able to hear, if you listen very carefully, you can hear Lou Kenton starting to shout in the hall. So you're hearing the account and you're hearing the original actuality. I'm hoping this is going to work, because it's very chilling if it works.
40, 50, 60 others decided to go into an